Okay, so may I introduce wonderful Mara-Daria Cojocaru. Is that the right way to express this? Cojocaru?
It's one way. It's Cojocaru.
Cojocaru.
Never mind.
Mara, you are a leading voice in interspecies solidarity, and you are a respected academic. You teach at the Munich School of Philosophy. And in your latest anthology, Solidarity with Wild Animals, you're calling for a shift in how we relate to nature. As a philosopher, Mara, can you explain how we came to that place of deep disconnection, to this concept where, as well, Alexa so beautiful referred to that we lost this connection, that we're a part of nature? From a philosophical point of view, when did that divide happen?
Okay, how much time do we have?
Not a lot.
I know. So I'll try to be very quick by perhaps contradicting you a little bit and saying I don't think that we all have always been living in this disconnect. And I actually think that when humans arrive on this planet, each and every human who first arrives on the planet is much more connected than we end up being after a long course of culturalization, what we call it, right? So we often use it to be more simple. You see it with children. Children take natural joy in other beings, human or not, animal or not. And we kind of teach our children that it's not really important to pay attention to these sorts of things. So I've been on a walk with a friend of mine and their child, and I was trying to point out, look, a swan, look, a goose. And the child would never respond. And then at some point the child was like, look, Mummy, an A-class, a Mercedes A-class. I was like, oh, wow. Other things are capturing the attention of this child than how I used to spend my time. When I was a child, I would always hang out in nature, hours on end, and I tried helping ants build high-rises. Obviously, they didn't need my help. But yeah, I kind of wasn't... I don't get the sense that we really nurture this natural curiosity in our children, and that's why we end up disconnected.
But is it like, when you look historically, is it Descartes' fault? Is it, who started saying, okay, we're here, we're human, and this is nature?
It's always easy to blame one man in particular, right? And we love to do that. But I think it's more complicated than that, because at the same time, we also had thinkers who were very much in favor of animals. And you always, if you look through culture and the history of thought, really, you always have the kind of culture, human humans and the nature animal humans, if you like. And there's always this a competition among voices and positions. And then it's really up to society whom to follow and whom to take seriously. And even if the ones who advocate for non-human voices to be heard and to be respected make it a bit more harder for us to lead our lives in a fashion that we find comfortable enough, we probably should, try to take that on as a learning experience. Does that make sense?
Interesting. My next panelist is wonderful Katrin Vohland. You are a biologist, and your career was very much based on tropical ecology. And today you are the Director General of one of my favorite museums. I hope many of... Does anybody know the Naturhistorisches Museum in Vienna? Oh, look at this, Katrin. Quite a few people.
Right.
So you are the Director General of the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and you have published a wonderful book on citizen science. You want to bridge science and society to tackle biodiversity and climate change. So, Katrin, tell us, what can a museum contribute to reconcile society with nature? Isn't a museum the place where, again, this difference is emphasized? Here's the human, and here I look at the object through a glass?
That's an interesting question, specifically for the Vienna Museum of Natural History, because that's really an evolutionary museum, and when it was planned and built, Ferdinand von Hochstetter, a Bavarian, by the way, he already included humans into this natural museum. So the history is really exciting. So it's very beautiful. It's an imperial museum. It's opposite to the arts museum. So we have stones, insects, butterflies, meteorites, and we also have archaeological findings up to human remains. So right from the beginning, Hochstetter, in the conception of the whole building, and you find it in the whole building, there was this connection between arts, evolution. We have Darwin in the museum, and it was some time ago. It was very Catholic, Austria at that time, but the idea of Darwin, of the idea of evolution is already implemented into the museum, also the evolution of man, finally. And there's a nice figure. You have a mirror and you have the ape, and the human didn't want to realize there's some connection and relationship to apes. So that is already in that building in. But of course, there's a disconnect. We show dead animals and dead stones, but we show them. And your question with regard, there's so many dimensions, but the question with regard to museums is that museums, we ourselves have perceptions of being very modern, being institutions to be very transformative. There was a 2-year debate within the museums community, within the International Museum Council. What is a museum? So there are expressions like empowerment and justice, but I think your idea of a museum is slightly a different one. And one thing we're also doing is citizen science in different areas, but a lot of projects really deal with nature. So people go out and observe nature, butterflies. There's an elaborated program, again, also developed by SEP. There is a program, for instance, looking for birds. And birds are one of the organisms which are really going into the reporting duties of the countries. And
a reporting
duty. So within the framework of the CBD, the Convention of Biological Diversity, each country who is a member, so Germany, Austria, and a lot of others except one, are members of the CBD and have this reporting duties. But again, citizen science is ambivalent in that perspective because people are not paid. Yeah? Normally, if you have reporting duties, and we already listened to this nice report on the new reporting directive, it becomes very expensive. But citizens and nature is so for free. So citizens go out, they are not paid to observe the birds, which are then used for the reporting duties to say something about the state of the environment. But we have the people outside, and that is the important thing. You need this connection to the real world, and there's an exchange with the groups in our museum to help to understand, if they want to know, which type of species is it, where is it coming from, is it important for decomposition or pollination or whatever. So we have also this exchange with this work on the basis and the scientific reflection.
So, so you are a big believer that citizen science projects really help people to reconnect or encourage them to reconnect, right? And you as you wrote in your book. Now I would like to introduce my last panelist, Jane Lawton. Thank you for being here. You are the Director of Impact at the Earth Species Project. And you're known for making complex scientific concepts accessible. ESP is using, and that's really interesting, ESP is using artificial intelligence to decode animal communication. So Jane, will decoding animal communication bridge the gap between us humans and animals, and how does that work? Give us an example.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. We've heard a lot today already about the importance of understanding nature better and understanding our connection to it, and kind of shifting the human mindset in terms of how we understand our place in the world. The power of artificial intelligence is moving so fast. We already know that it can translate across human languages without dictionaries. We've seen incredible progress in this space. And our intuition is that if we can take the advances that we're seeing in the human language processing domain, transfer that over to animal language, we are going to learn extraordinary things about our fellow species. And I think what's really important here, again, we've talked a lot about understanding, but our fundamental premise is that our ability to understand is actually limited by our ability to perceive. As human beings, we're very, very limited in that ability, and so much of nature is communicating around us all the time, and we don't even know it's happening. So if we can find a way through artificial intelligence to make sense of all of the data that is being gathered now on other species, and there's a lot of it, and start to find patterns in that data, it will shed new light on what is going on in the lives, the minds of our fellow species, And our hope is that we can begin to learn from that in order to begin to see a new way of being in the world.
Can you give us an example?
Well,
What have you learned about how do animals talk to each other?
So I think there's a couple of things to point out here. First, this is a very new field, so it's brand new. And so we're at the stage as an organization, what we do is build machine learning models. We work in close partnership with scientists who are out in the field, collecting data and studying other species. Many of them have been doing this for decades. So we are helping them to build tools that will accelerate the pace of their discoveries. So if you think about a scientist who's studying orangutans, we have a partner, Adriano Lamera. Orangutans don't vocalize very often. So he's out there, he's recording them in the rainforest, and then he gets 10,000 hours of recordings, and currently a human being has to sit and listen to those 10,000 hours of recordings, even to figure out when a vocalization is happening, and then to go further and to classify the vocalizations. What kind of call or vocalization is this? We are building tools that can do that kind of work.
Give us an example.
An example of a tool? So we've
No,
built...
well, an example of things you heard animals say. What about elephants? Or what
yes,
about...
so elephants, the most recent research has shown, have names for each other, which is very powerful. There's many other species like marmosets, the newest discoveries are. They have distinct names from each other that they learn from their parents. So this is an extraordinary piece where people don't connect to that kind of idea. Orangutans.
What about pets inside of my home?
Well, so we are not currently working on companion animals, and there's a reason for that. The reason being that we already, as human beings, put our dogs and our cats and our other companion animals in a special space. Somehow we erect a barrier in our minds and say they're special. They don't need the same kind of or they need more consideration than other species. So we feel that if we're going to transform the way human beings think about other animals, this can't be in the space of novelty. This can't be about, I can speak to my dog using an app. It's got to be something much more transformative than that. But one example I'd love to just share with the group, which kind of blew my mind when I first started this work. If we think about other animals and the way they are communicating at the frequencies, so human beings can hear at about 20 kilohertz. The new research shows that plants actually emit distress signals, acoustic distress signals, at about 70 kilohertz. Your cat can hear at 70 kilohertz. So we don't know if this is true yet or not, but you could imagine a situation where you're sitting in your house and you've forgotten to water your plants for a couple of weeks, and they're sending out a distress signal, and your cat can hear it, but you can't. That, for me, just put me in a completely new space when I realized that that is possibly happening around me, and I can't connect to it.
So now we're
but
going
AI
to watch
is going to help
we're
us
going
do that.
to look at our cat. If the cat looks alarmed, and then
Exactly.
I know I'll have to water my plant.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much, Jane. Exciting. Mara, so you call for solidarity with wild animals, and it's solidarity what you call for. Is solidarity the kind of interspecies relationship that's going to help us reconnect with wild animals?
First, just to say that the solidarity with animals is really meant to apply to not just wild animals, but really to all animals, although I take a special interest in wild animals. And yes, I think that solidarity is a super important concept here, not just to reconnect, but to connect in the right ways. Because we talk a lot about understanding, but it's not just yesterday that humans started trying to understand other species. We have done pretty well at that, which is why we have all these domesticated species, for instance. It's just that animals always got the wrong end of the deal, if you like, right? They got a very bad deal from us. Solidarity as a framework is not just about sort of paying animals fairly for something they didn't volunteer to give us anyway. It's about seeing them as members of our community and thinking about what do we as a community need to provide them with so that they can flourish too. And it's important to think about solidarity in at least 3 ways. That's something that's pretty well established in the scholarship at this point in time. On the one hand, we've got social solidarity, which is just a description of all the habits in which humans and animals connect and interact anyways. And there's a question whether all the ways in which we do so is good, okay? And then we've got something like political solidarity, where we find out perhaps it's not such a good idea to always separate mother from their offspring. So perhaps we should look into protecting these special relationships much more robustly. And so we call for certain rights of non-human mothers to be respected. And that is disruptive. We talked about the Bavarian milk industry today, or at least the politician in the room did. So, but there is an issue here, and solidarity allows us, and that's what I like about the concept too. If you look at ethics, often you can walk away and think it's just about rights or just about welfare, just one value that's the sort of decisive one. Solidarity allows you to talk about multiple values, also conflicting values, and make them work in the context of a community. And so the last point of the tripartite that I want to get across is civic solidarity, which is when we've changed our habits, when we've made progress on certain important social justice issues for other animals, and then we build institutions that allow for these interests to be protected even when feelings of empathy or compassion are low. People struggle to feel empathetic with animals who are not cute or are not very similar to us. But
you think they will feel solidarity?
Yeah, because if it is, so if you grow up in a community where it is just a matter of course that every building is designed in a way that bats, not everyone is a fan of bats, bats can nest there. If there are insect hotels as a matter of course, when there are passageways for predators, wolves coming into communities, well they will, and they are not, they have their place here, but we need to learn ways of cohabiting. And if in our design, in our urban design, and how we organize our practices, animals are always already taken into account. Children will grow up, they might volunteer in their spare time or as civil service for these institutions, and they will learn and take away, well, these other members of the community are important too, and they won't be sitting here like we do today and wondering, oh, what might that insect need? Or oh, does that animal really suffer? I didn't think so, it didn't talk to me that way.
I see. It's definitely a super interesting concept to bring in solidarity. It's definitely a very new one, fresh one. Katrin, indigenous cultures refer to gifts of nature when we talk about ecosystem services. How can we reconcile these two ways of looking onto nature, and what can we learn from indigenous cultures?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Probably everybody knows the IPCC, IPBES perhaps less. And there was in the beginning the development of this international framework, Sepp mentioned it, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services.
So you say there's the IPCC, which is the big climate report from all, and then the IPBES, which is the one on biodiversity.
There was the global community, and indigenous communities have a voice also in the CBD and the IPBES and these processes. And there was the process how to frame what IPBES is going to do. And as you said, and we also saw these figures, nature, ecosystem services. So it's a very different approach than to approach nature as Mother Nature. And I like the figure also where we have humans in the circle because we have to eat, we will die, Erde zu Erde. And we are perhaps, on one hand, we are not that central as we think in a biological sense. On the other hand, we are a bit different, and perhaps we are even in the Western society a bit different than others. One of the most interesting books I read in last time is The Most Weird People of the World, also Die seltsamsten Menschen der Welt von Henrich. And
so it mentioned that we are the most weird people of the world.
I talk about us in this room, more or less. And
we meaning European, westernized world.
Yes, and I found it super interesting because he brought it back also to the church, more to the Protestant church, and the idea that we can read, and that reading and letters are a bit more abstract. And this abstraction leads to organizations like Lawton, which we very much like, but it distracted us perhaps a bit more from nature. And if you work in the international context, you're always astonished. Perhaps here's also a bit astonishing. If you have the whole family on the stage, that is very unusual in Western contexts. Normally, you avoid to have your husband, your son, or what in your company. If you go to other parts of the world, it's a bit more normal. So it's a bit more this connectivity, this idea of a family, also a bit more connected with nature. But it has advantages and also disadvantages. And I discussed it a bit with my colleagues. And then they asked me, Katrin, do you want to drive back the Enlightenment? And I said, no, of course not. Because I also appreciate very much this other view to look at nature, and I think the way out is not to say...
And do you think those two ways to look at nature, Mother Nature and here the scientific approach, will they find a common language? Or in your scientific word, do you already have a common language? Or do the one party still continue to talk about Mother Nature and gifts, and you say, this is the numbers and ecosystem service?
We work hard to find a common language. This is one of these issues, how to integrate indigenous or traditional knowledge into the scientific system. It's a very debate in the scientific community. It's also dealing with names. We name plants, everything like with a system which is globally accepted, genera and then the species name. But there are other conceptions of knowledge, but which does us not help scientifically, but we need this discourse. And the other thing we are confronted with, and the Arts Museum even more, or the archaeological museums, is all this debate of colonialismus and neocolonialismus. And that is something we have to address. And I personally think it's not helpful to always talk about guilt, because it was not personally me or so, but the idea is to understand what happened in the countries and what are also the long-term impacts we still have. Then we talk about nature conservation areas and so on, how difficult it is and so on, but it's also our lifestyle, it's also our impact, it's also a lot of the structures which are persistent. So I think on what we can do as a museum or scientific institution to really look for a language. For instance, we have connections to the Tipapa Museum. We gave back some human remains, and the Tipapa Museum is also a mediating institution between the indigenous population. I have not a direct contact, but we need this discourse to see how they deal with nature. They have it also dealing with life and death, a completely other approach, and to really learn from each other, but then go a step further also into the political area. It has much to do also with justice, with global justice and how power is distributed.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought the aspect of justice back in the discussion, absolutely. Yeah. Jane, can you tell me, the Earth Species Project, do you have an idea how this will change our relationship to animals, the animal world, and do you have already an idea where will we be in 30 years, or let's just say 10 years from now?
We have lots of ideas. At this point, many of them are ideas. I think one of the things I feel really strongly about, and particularly hearing so much of what's happening in this room, is that we have a window of opportunity right now. Before I joined Earth Species Project, I worked in broader sustainability circles. And when you're thinking about systemic change, and this is what we're looking for here, we're not looking to tinker around the edges. We're not just looking for slightly different approaches to how we value nature. We're looking for systemic shifts because we know they will be needed if we're going to overcome the polycrisis that we're facing. And in sustainability systems change circles, they talk about something called the multi-level perspective, which is essentially when there is a convergence of pressures from the landscape, and simultaneously there are radical new ideas emerging from the niche. When those two things come together, they create this incredible window of opportunity for change. And if we think about the pressure we are experiencing as a species from the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the crises of inequality, and you think of some of the things that are starting to bubble up around, as an example, maybe it's not, as we heard this morning, a vote for every single organism on the planet, but potentially we could begin to lean into the rights for nature movement, which is really burgeoning.
Understanding more.
understanding better.
Oh,
So right
okay,
now,
they give names to each other, so...
we take animal perspectives through a human trying to understand them. What if you could more directly understand an animal's preferences and needs? How would that actually bring those ideas into Rights for Nature? We may have a totally different, completely wrong understanding of what their desires and needs are currently. So this opens a window for us to learn directly from those species.
Very exciting. Maybe just a very, very, very brief closing remark from the three of you. What do you need? What do you think on an institutional, political level would it take in order to implement some of the things that are really dear and important to you? On a very, what do you think? What is needed? Why are things so slow, and what is needed? Very short, if it's possible. Otherwise?
I'm going to say something provocative, which kind of goes outside the realm of my current organization, which is we've heard lots of things about valuing nature differently and gathering data and measuring things, etc. I think we may need to actually put our minds in the space of degrowth. That we live on a finite planet. We cannot look for infinite growth in our economic systems. So how do we start to transform our understanding of well-being for humans and for other beings that does not include infinite growth?
Not a very popular thought.
I know.
Probably very accurate.
I know.
Do you agree degrowth is the thing?
Well, I mean, I suppose this morning when I sat at the breakfast, which was very lavish, and I normally don't have breakfast that early.
But make it short, though.
Okay. No, I'll turn to something different then, because I never have breakfast. No, look, I think what's really important is that we genuinely try to take the rest of nature, and we are part of nature, seriously. We're not doing it by just saying, oh, how can it be of better service to us? And it will be uncomfortable. I think that's the sort of uncomfortable truth, but it's always... I think we are stuck on the model of maintaining a culture of comfort and well-being when
so
we
this needs to change. No more comfort and well-being?
No more. No.
A different approach.
A different approach, and then that takes the interests of other animals seriously, like really seriously, not just lip service.
I definitely do.
Can I just add super quickly to that? I know we don't have... It's about optimizing for the whole, instead of constantly optimizing for the human, for the individual as well as the human
Very good point.
species.
Exactly, for the individual. We don't
sorry, solidarity really means also be willing to carry costs, even if you do not get a direct payment in return. It's a non-tit-for-tat thing.
A very brief last remark. Katrin?
One of the questions in this morning was why humans are so successful on this earth. And I think you really need to understand evolution. Humans are not successful because they kill each other. You see, those countries are not successful. Successful is, and you perhaps also take a bit more feministic view on this, is because people cooperate. You
said a feministic view.
Yes, you will never get a child adult without cooperation. So this cooperation, this communication is key. And we have institutions like IPBES and so on, and we should think a bit more on this way and also negotiate our interests. Yes, sometimes perhaps a bit lazy. Yeah.